We all do.
Well, welcome to our first working session in this important seminar. We're going to have 3 speakers today. Each one represents one of the empires that is the subject of our seminar. Professor Gamal Kafadar will talk about the Ottoman Empire. Dr. Rajeev Kinra about the Mughal Empire. We will follow that order which is in the program. And Professor Babayan on the Safavid Empire. So this session is really at the very heart of our seminar, and I'm particularly happy to be here in this session because so much of our studies, I myself am an Ottomanist, so much of our studies tend to be fragmented. When we study the Ottoman world, for example, I study the Arab part of the Ottoman world. People like Professor Kafadar study the Anatolian part of the Ottoman world. We do not communicate very well. The two parts of the various parts, of course, there's also the Balkan world. We do not, I mean, academically, I mean, personally we do, but academically, the dialogue is not very smooth. So I think it is very important not only to do that, especially given the amount of work that is being done, and to also create a kind of dialogue between these different, we can say different fields, because that's what they are for the most part. These fields have not communicated in the past very well together, and that's why I think this seminar is so important. I don't want to take up much time. We have a couple of hours, and according to what Jamil just told me, we're going to shorten if you don't mind, shorten the lectures to 20 minutes so that we can have a little bit more time for discussion since we are a little bit late. So could you cut whatever you had to say, cut it to 20 minutes, and it will open the room for more discussion. From.
Thank you. Maybe I can do this. I did not wish to leave you imageless, so I'm not going to show you many pictures, but here I have, instead of the better known picture of a coffee house from the 1580s of a coffee house in Istanbul, in honor of my chair for the panel and in honor of the great scholar Nelihana, whose work inspired me a lot over the years, I show you a much less known picture of a coffee house in Cairo, spreading across the 2 banks of the Nile, circa 1590, the depiction. It's a translation of the famous Jifr el-Jami with depictions from the late 16th century. And the great thing here, it not only spreads across the 2 banks of the Nile, but look at the people on the boats. They have coffee cups in their hands. This is drive-through way before it was invented. Makes us think about entrepreneurial ingenuity in all of this. Yes. Okay. I too would like to begin by thanking my dear colleague Cemil Aydın and George Mason University and NEH for making all this possible. And time is short. Let me jump right into what I want to say. Given the charge that we have, namely speak about historiography mostly, what I would call historiography. Regarding Ottoman history, many people here are witness to, readers of, and in fact participants of the larger process that we have been calling a paradigm shift in the field since the late 20th century, say the last 2-3 decades or so. In terms of intellectual history, we can locate it in a moment of post-structuralism, post-colonialism, and various other larger isms that characterize the late 20th century. And in terms of world events or the larger political context in a serious and broad sense of politics, we can think of it as a moment defined by the dissolution of the bipolar world order, the breakup of the Soviet and Yugoslav regimes, and the breakup of the equilibrium of post-Ottoman nation states with their own versions of Ottoman history, which remained valid until the 1980s and 90s, at least in their own turf. It's these larger moments within which we have to realize, as scholars who want to contextualize everything we read, within which we should contextualize our own paradigm shift. This new sort of interest in the Ottoman past is sometimes dubbed, and mostly in Turkey or with respect to Turkey, but not only limited, not just limited to Turkey. This new sort of interest in the Ottoman past is sometimes dubbed Neo-Ottomanism. And it may be appropriate for certain purposes, but I will avoid the term since it has acquired various connotations in the arena of international relations that would divert us from the topic of my focus, namely from the exceedingly complex, multi-layered, multivalent, fecund but also stifling at times, curious, baffling cultural phenomenon of a reappraisal and a reappropriation of the Ottoman past by various actors in various different ways. This new relationship to the Ottoman past is unfolding in many spheres, and the academic sphere, much as we might like to, cannot abstract itself from the others. Namely, in the beginning when I spoke about paradigm shift, I guess many of you assumed that I was speaking about the academic world only, but not really. And I don't think we can treat that larger shift merely speaking about academia. It's part of a much larger thing happening. And this reappraisal and reconfiguration are taking place not only in Turkey, but throughout the former Ottoman space. And not only in the former Ottoman space, but throughout the public cultures of the world, where the Ottoman past somehow, in varying degrees, I don't want to make a big deal out of it, but throughout the public cultures of the world, where the Ottoman past somehow figures in public debates. Take the notion of decentering the Renaissance, for instance. Of course, in La Repubblica, you do get articles occasionally in which people refer to some reassessment, and I have examples of this, or revisions within the field of Ottoman studies because of the impact it has in making us rethink certain givens of European or world history. In other words, Ottoman history plays an increasingly critical role in the increasingly critical reassessment of the narrative of modernity throughout the world. Again, I don't want to make a big deal out of this, but it does play a role in varying degrees in academia and beyond in different public cultures. Moreover, I would add, since this kind of a conference tends to forget or not often mention the Byzantine past and the medieval Islamic past, though the earlier plenary panel would belie what I just said, with respect, this transformation is happening not only with respect to Ottoman history, but also with respect to Byzantine history. I don't have time to go into that, but one of the most important instances of this reconfiguration of Byzantine studies is the burgeoning of the field in Turkey, and again, academically and beyond. Like all complex cultural phenomena, it does have political imbrications, and it may yet engender projects on the plane of policy, domestic or international. Be that as it may, that is not what I am speaking about. There is clearly a cultural phenomenon, an unprecedented effort to own Ottoman history, to draw inspiration from it, to take pride in it, to consume it, to make sense of it, to disparage it, to rethink it, what have you. To focus on the Turkish scene for a few minutes, and the Turkish scene matters a lot, for better or worse, in shaping the dynamics of Ottoman studies. We tend to forget or overlook or dismiss these kinds of glances at public cultures elsewhere because speaking about such topics in the United States, we generally assume a level field, an equally globalized discourse in which what we say here as we is really going to be speaking about the way Ottoman studies is taking shape. But it's much more than that. And as I said, within the former Ottoman space, Turkey is only one example, but for better or worse, it plays a very important role. And let me focus there for a second. To focus on Turkish scene for a few minutes, which shapes the dynamics of our field, remember, it might be said that the pendulum has been swinging from fleeing the oppressive weight of history to a euphoric rediscovery, even reconquista of history, primarily but not merely Ottoman history. Not that history was neglected or not manipulated before in the early Republican era, but there was a diet, you might call it. When it came to history, especially Ottoman history, Turkey was not anorexic, but it was on a diet, somewhat ascetic even. While it is a welcome development that the diet is relaxed, there may be good reasons to worry about approaching obesity, namely too much of history. Ultimately, it's not a matter of quantity, of course, but the combination, even symbiosis of this appetite with consumerism in our neoliberal age gives one pause. Tourism has turned into not only an industry, but an avalanche and steamrolls over this appetite for history. Even the everything included $1 a day kind of tourist is subjected to site visits that need to be embellished with stories of the harem and whatnot. This in itself may be laughed away, even considered a well-deserved form of postmodern torture on couch potatoes. But the awareness of tourism as an industry is ubiquitous and becoming uncritically accepted as a good, or at least harmless thing that brings people's cultures and heritage sites together for mutual understanding. Beyond tourism, though closely related to it, if you look at restaurant menus in Turkey, in the former Ottoman space, and elsewhere actually, you do find many new references to this cultural phenomenon that one might or might not want to call neo-Ottoman. Le Monde, for instance, presents a story on some successful career women in Turkey as these are the new Ottoman women. The New York Times sums up the new culinary trends in Istanbul as a manifestation of neo-Ottomanism, etc., etc. Where is Ottoman history of the sort that brought us together in all this? In the last 2 or 3 decades, the paradigm shift I referred to has been taking place, of course, mostly within the academia where we use words such as paradigm. In the last 2 or 3 decades, pointed revision and reconceptualization has characterized the field of Ottoman history. For our purposes here, I would like to underline the following interrelated developments and then say a few words about each. The questioning of the questioning of the decline paradigm, which I would rather characterize or see transformed into a confrontation with the rise and decline narratives. The ones in the field might know that I had a brief article on the purity and corruption of the Janissaries, which was intended to deal exactly with that, the rise and decline narratives, before I even wrote on decline. The second bit of those interrelated developments I would call the rethinking of the role of Ottoman history within the larger narrative of world history. The third is the realization that we cannot continue to do Ottoman history without a trans-regional, trans-imperial, transnational framework, which brings us into the significance of Safavid and Mughal history in particular. But before I speak about the three empires perspective, allow me to point out that the transtemporal dimension of Ottoman history, a word I just made up, the transtemporal dimension of Ottoman history also needs to be developed in the same context. In other words, diachronically speaking as well, the embeddedness of Ottoman history, the people, the institutions, the dynamics, the practices, in its own medieval Islamic and Byzantine past is not sufficiently recognized and developed. And that's part of the set of issues within which we have to also deal with the Safavids and Mughals and other contemporaneous polities and societies. So I won't say much about that, but let me make that transtemporal point. That was the third point, looking the realization that we cannot continue to do Ottoman history without a transregional perspective. And fourthly, I would say, I would hesitantly call it the de-Turkification, or rather, the decentering of the narrative that privileges the linear story of the Turks from Central Asia to Manzikert, to Seljuk history, to Ottoman history, and then to the Turkish Republic. There is that kind of a linear narrative that has been so central in the way historical imagination is configured in Ottoman studies that one needs to deal with it, no matter what one ultimately wants to do with it. Okay. Small comments on each one of these four developments that I just mentioned. I have been for a long while engaged with a critical analysis of the decline paradigm along with many other colleagues, and I guess in this room most people, at least if they looked at the web pages prepared by the organizers of this meeting, have seen that this is one of the most interesting developments in the field of Ottoman studies in the last 2-3 decades. But I, along with many other colleagues again, have been constantly thinking of an alternative narrative based on an alternative conceptualization without overlooking the fact that Ottoman decline consciousness or Ottoman declinism is very much a part of the world that one wants to analyze when one is looking at the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. Moreover, for the decline paradigm, to the degree we are engaged in a critical analysis of prevailing modes of historiography and historical consciousness, I do not see how I can walk away from the task of confronting it. I know that there's only so much one can take. Enough of the decline paradigm. Be done with it and move on to something new. I hear myself saying to myself and many others, including students. But at the same time, for one, Ottoman declinism is very much a part of the world we are studying. And for two, it is so deeply embedded in the historiography that our critical engagement with it somehow brings this to the table. In any case, moreover, still the prevailing and the dominant mode of thinking about later Ottoman history is through the decline paradigm out there in the world, and not just beyond academia. Even within academia, in a small coterie of colleagues, Ottomanists and others who are up with their readings in Ottoman studies, the word may have become the D word, but beyond it, most of my colleagues still think very much through the decline paradigm, and thus I feel that we cannot just give up the task of confronting it. Or the D word is avoided simply for the sake of political correctness, which amounts to the same thing in my mind, and that's the other problem. Anyway, simple or even simplistic as it seems, decline is a highly effective conceptual tool in that it enables its users to weave together, often implicitly, processes in the political, social, cultural, and economic spheres, particularly because it comes with a great supporting cast of sinister words like decay, decadence, degeneration, debauchery, etc. Hence, alternative conceptualizations need to be constructed with an eye to eliciting the same level of performance in our struggle to shed light on that past. Likewise with the question of early modernity, which brings us to the second aspect of the reassessment, namely the role of Ottoman history within the larger narrative of world history. The concept is important to me, but it is just as important to recognize that there is a new age. So we are actually discussing two things here, whether it's appropriate to designate it by the concept of early modernity, but that it, in itself, as underlined, say, by Hodgson, as a new age, as a new period, as a post-medieval of some sort of these societies, needs to be reckoned with, whether one uses the concept of early modernity or not. And that task should be seen in its own right. Okay. The question of early modernity has been reduced to a matter of political correctness too, like decline. For some people, it's just a word to use to be done with this. And sometimes it's reduced to a few emblematic phenomena. But the important thing, the true task of intellectual significance to me is to develop an understanding that recognizes the interconnectedness and interactivity of multiple spheres of life. Language, social life, literature, architecture, economic and business practices, state practices. If modernity or the modern are going to be used as meaningful concepts, one certainly has to deal with this interconnectedness and interactivity of multiple spheres to endow it with meaning. Or, as I said, play with other notions and likewise perform the same kind of function. I have been trying to conceptualize an understanding of Ottoman early modernity in such a way as to, one, connect these different spheres, and two, think of them as world historical developments. Changes in linguistic practice could be, for instance, seen in the light of the long-term process of vernacularization in many parts of the world, so on and so forth. In more practical terms, I have focused on coffee and coffee houses and the conquest and colonization of the nighttime. One thing leads to another, and these metaphors, conquest and colonization of nighttime, are not my metaphors, but I've been using them. And it's part of the development of my research on coffee and coffee houses. And it actually developed out of my lifelong obsession with understanding the nature of Ottoman politics and of Ottoman public life through the prism of a series of spectacular political events, namely the so-called Janissary revolts. Which brings us to the political dimension of this quest, namely, was there politics beyond despotism and chaos? These are the two options offered to us by the time-honored Orientalist paradigm, in which I'm being reductionistic, of course, but I think you understand what I mean, that there is a despotic polity, and there are times of chaos in which the nature of, or the persons of representing despotism might be changing, but otherwise, is there, my question is, a ground in which politics is negotiated, rethought, reconceptualized, that we can make sense of beyond this binary? I am experimenting lately with the notion of writing a history of urban life in the early modern era with Istanbul at the center. Not to make the point that this is the only or the best way to anchor that story, but because it offers certain advantages as a vantage point that I find worth exploiting, such as the story of coffee houses, which is meaningful only when treated as a global story. A coffee house from Amsterdam, the one that I quickly flipped through before, was the first one in London, 1660. But what I want to come to is this picture. A treatise in German in the 1680s, in which you see coffee, tea, and chocolate as drink, represented in the same picture through the Ottoman, the Chinese, and the Native American as holders of the cups, that become part of this global moment of the 17th century in which social beverages have conquered the world, so to speak, and coffee is just one of them. Hence, the story may have Istanbul as a vantage point for its own purposes, but it has to be a global story.
Are you finishing?
Yes. I want to pay brief tribute to people who developed the notion of connected histories and integrative histories before we really got to the trans moment of transregionalism and transnationalism, primarily Hodgson, Fletcher, and Martin Dixon, who should also be mentioned in the same connection. Now, on the transregional turn, an extraordinary experience early in my academic life has shaped much of my thinking, which is a series of annual meetings held at Harvard between 1989 and 1984, organized by Tosun Arıcanlı and Eşref Ghani, who were way ahead of their times. We were trying to think in those meetings of the larger space, the Ottoman Safavid Mughal Empire space, from the Danube, say, all the way to Southeast Asia, with everything around them, characterized by flows of goods and peoples and ideas. And I met most of my colleagues in Safavid and Mughal history and developed friendships and intellectual relations that continue to sustain me in those venues. But we were deliberately trying in those meetings, I want to underline, to not only do, or in fact move away from, to the degree possible, comparative history, rather do what we then yet did not have a name for, transregional and trans-imperial and transnational history, thanks to the pioneering efforts of Tosun Arıcanlı and Eşref Ghani, as I said. Since then, the scholarship on the three empires and on other regions and societies of the early modern world moved ever more deliberately toward developing the analytical purchase and the empirical basis of transregional and trans-imperial approaches. Scholars of the history of art and architecture in our field, I think in Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal imperial histories, have done the most work in this respect, the most meaningful, the most substantive, and the most, to me, inspirational work in this regard, though it often does not get noted in mainstream foci on mainstream Ottoman studies, whatever that may be. By that one means usually Ottoman history based on archival work. In any case, Ottoman historians still seem to suffer from a stiff neck, as their head and thus their gaze is turned mostly toward Europe. That seems to be the default position, something like this, looking from Constantinople. While looking at Iran or India requires a special effort that needs explanation still. And this is partly related to the peculiarities of the Ottoman Turkish story of modernization, which brings me to my last point, decentering the linear Turkish narrative, or the ethnicizing narrative, one should say. It's not only a matter of speaking about the Turkification, I would also call it de-ethnicization through those linear narratives of one ethno-national stock is the main protagonist of history. Anyway. Okay.
1 minute.
Okay.
It's
a last minute, amputation.
It's fine. No, please finish.
I just want to go to this de-Turkification. Now, it's very important to my heart. Who owns Ottoman or Byzantine history? Turks and Greeks, respectively? Certainly not. First of all, it is not a matter of wishful academic thinking to say that they belong to our common humanity for empirical as well as philosophical and ethical reasons. This is what brings us together here. But there is no denying at the same time that there is a special relationship between certain historical legacies and some people who want to make a claim on those legacies. There may be a special relationship between Ottoman history and the people who call themselves Turks today, as well as between Byzantine history and the people who call themselves Greeks today, and that ought to be recognized, cherished, contested, etc. But there is a special relationship also between Ottoman history and all the non-Turkish peoples of the former Ottoman world. I am not referring to exclusivist national historiographies, but the communal memories, stories of victimization included, and self-defining narratives as interpreted by historians true to their humanistic discipline. And if all these ownerships speak to each other in a non-exclusivist, non-revanchist, and non-triumphalist manner, I think we can perhaps move to the kind of historiography that would be characterized by the best intentions of this kind of conference. In fact, I think to some degree this has started to happen, but I don't have time to get into it. For Safavid history, or Mughal history for that matter, in fact, Iranian history for the last millennium, it seems to me that there are similar issues related to essentialization of ethnic, linguistic, or cultural identities, especially the Turk and the Persian. But I should turn to colleagues who know better. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah? Okay. Before I get into Mughal historiography, I have one caveat. I have some of you know, I have a 1-month-old baby at home, so I'm not sleeping very well. And in fact, last night I slept about 6 hours, which was the longest continuous sleep I've had in over a month. So, but that aside, if I ramble, my apologies in advance. Second preliminary point is I don't think anyone has mentioned this today, and I wasn't necessarily going to, but it strikes me as, I don't know if it's ironic or what, but it's quite striking to me anyway, the synchronicity of this meeting happening in Washington, D.C., just a few days after a different meeting was held down the road in the Congress. And, the sort of experts that are called to testify about what Islam is and what Islam means in that room are obviously different. And I remember watching with sadness and wondering why some of the people in this room weren't being called over there to speak with some degree of authority about what Islam is. It is the same problem. But anyway, I don't have there's not a point to that. I just thought somebody should mention it. Last thing is just to connect with the earlier panel. I was speaking with Jim Leach briefly when he had to leave, but I spoke with him outside, and he was remarking on the humor in the verse that goes with the cupbearer that you showed. And I told him, this is a very common theme in Persian poetry, and in Urdu poetry, and Turkish poetry, and all over the place. And it made me think of, humor generally in, the part of the world that I study is not really categorized as part of our historiography, as part of our literary historiography, as part of our intellectual history, any of that. So it brought to mind a couplet by Urdu poet Mirza Muhammad Rafi Sauda from the 18th century. Kaaba agarche toota to kya jaye gham hai sheikh, ye kasre dil nahi ke banaya na jayega. Probably not many Urdu speakers in the room. Sarah will know what that means. So what if the Kaaba gets broken, O sheikh, which was mentioned in the earlier poem, O cleric? It's not the citadel of the heart that can't be rebuilt, right? There's a very funny verse. Sauda was one of the most humorous satirists of the 18th century, widely known, one of the 5 great Urdu poets, but a verse like that doesn't really fit into Mughal historiography. Poets like Sauda and Mir, his contemporary, his great contemporary, they don't fit when we think of what Mughal historiography is. Why is that? Well, one of the things that I tell my students is that this is the period of decline. Sauda was in the 18th century. This is the period when apparently the only thing that mattered was Clive and the Battle of Plassey in 1757. That is to say, the arrival of the British. Now, one of the reasons the decline narrative is so stubborn, let's say, in Mughal historiography, it's part of the larger historiography of Islamic decline, right, Golden Age and so on and so forth. But the Mughals, there are sub-rise and decline narratives, as Professor Kafadar talked about. So in the case of Mughals, I always draw a paragraph, a parabola on the chalkboard for my students, and I don't have one here, and I should have made a mock-up for PowerPoint, but I don't know how to do that. So the parabola begins with Babur arriving in 1526 and founding the empire, but of course Babur is only there for 4 years before he dies. Very famous story. He gives his life for his son, to God. Anyway, so Humayun gets the empire and he has it for a few years, but then he gives it away to Sher Shah the Afghan, who is somehow forgotten. The 15-year Afghan interregnum, as the Mughal historians used to call it, is really often forgot. It's a sort of blank space in Mughal historiography. But so Humayun, he has to run to Safavid Iran, where he pays for the hospitality of the Shah with the Koh-i-Noor diamond, which was said to be able to feed the entire world's population for a day. And Humayun spends, 15 years there. He comes back in 1555, regains his kingdom for 1 year, and then he falls down, probably drunk. He falls down the steps of his observatory and dies. As another Mughal historian, I believe of the 60s, I think this was written in the 60s, said, Humayun stumbled out of life as he stumbled through it. It's very, very sad commentary. But Humayun represents an uptick because he was the father of Akbar. And anyone who knows anything about Mughal historiography knows Akbar. If they don't know anything else, they know Akbar. Akbar the Great, contemporary of Queen Elizabeth in England, reigned for nearly 50 years, 1556 to 1605, consolidated the empire, built, expanded the empire, married Hindus, encouraged tolerance, talked to Jesuits. He was just an all-around great guy. And he, translated Sanskrit texts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we know that Akbar was great, if nothing else. So Akbar, is like, we're almost at the zenith of the parabola. Then comes Jahangir, who, incidentally, speaking of translocality and trans-regionalism and integration of Ottoman and Safavid and Mughal history, Jahangir, his given name was Salim. But when he became emperor, he says this explicitly in his memoirs, he changed his name to Jahangir, that is to say world conqueror, because he didn't want to be confused with the Ottoman Kaiser, Salim. So you can see the horizon of his metageography right there, There's a world audience here reading my memoir. Anyway, that's an aside. So Jahangir, unfortunately, was a drunk, and he was addicted to opium. This is what you will read. If you read anything from the 50s and the 60s, this is what it will say. He was, and he handed the keys of the empire to his wife, Noor Jahan, which is a great step for gender equity, but it, represents his failure as a kind of imperial force, let's say. So, with Jahangir, the parabola starts to come down. Then comes Shah Jahan, who everyone acknowledges as great, magnificent builder of monuments and so forth, like the Taj Mahal. Anyone who has ever seen a travel brochure or a movie poster that involves India in any way has seen the Taj Mahal. even in Slumdog Millionaire, magically somehow they end up from Bombay, they get on a train and they end up at Agra. I don't know how it happens, but anyway. So everyone knows the Taj Mahal. Shah Jahan built it. Great, magnificent builder of monuments and so forth. The Red Fort, Jama Masjid, all these things. But if you read any Mughal historiography that was written, even now, really, you will always see a line in there, something that says, but with Shah Jahan, there was a hint of a return to orthodoxy. The specter is coming. So there's a hint of return to orthodoxy. Why? Well, there are a lot of reasons. There's a few, measly details that people pick on to build this narrative. I would say, based on my own reading of materials from Shah Jahan's era, that this is complete nonsense. But anyway, that's how the narrative is cast. And the reason Shah Jahan as a return to orthodoxy, as a hint of a return to orthodoxy is so important is because everyone after Akbar is seen as prelude to Aurangzeb, who comes to the throne in 1658. Those of you who know Mughal history know this. He's the son of Shah Jahan. He basically usurps the throne. There's a huge war of succession among the four brothers. But usually it's cast as between the two brothers, Dara Shikoh and Aurangzeb. Dara Shikoh, the good Muslim, who was liberal and tolerant and patronized Sufis and tried to translate and did translate the Upanishads. I'll get back to that in a minute if I have time. So Dara is seen as the good, liberal, the inheritor of Akbar's legacy, the great-grandson. And you look in any historiography, you will see them paired together. He is defeated by his brother Aurangzeb, who is often pigeonholed, unfairly I would say, as simply a fanatic who, I don't want to get into the details. But that is the dynamic. And so with Aurangzeb, everything drops off the cliff. Fanaticism comes, this alienates the Hindus, there's religious strife, and he drains the treasury with attempts to expand the domain of Islam. That's the only reason he invades the Deccan, is to expand the geography of Islam. And this exhausts the treasury, and this, basically causes the weakening of the Mughal Empire that opens the door for the British. I mean, that's, in, I was going to say 20 words or less, but in, 200 words or less, that's the narrative of Mughal history that we have inherited and remains as recently as 1992. John Richards was a great scholar of the Mughal Empire, but that's essentially the narrative in his, seminal textbook that is still used. So what you have in Mughal historiography is a situation where, whereas in Europe and America you have long 18th centuries, in India we have a kind of short one. It begins in 1658, and then nothing of any relevance happens until, I don't know, the founding of the Asiatic Society, or maybe Plassey in 1757, but really until Warren Hastings comes. And after that it's, the history of British India. So there's a huge gap in there where nothing gets talked about precisely because of this pre-existing narrative. Of course, there's plenty of evidence to contradict the narrative. How much time do I have?
You have 10 minutes.
10 minutes. I haven't even got to my 3 main points. Okay.
Well, you started off with
I know, this was too long and anecdotal. Okay. So that is, how decline is portrayed in Mughal historiography. Now, there are sort of 3 other related but not quite the same problems with how Mughal historiography has been written, let's say, in the last 60 years, that I, in my work, try to respond to. I mean, that's, I think, what we were asked to discuss. The first is a problem of what history and historians have been interested in. That is to say, in the immediate aftermath, post-independence period, that's 1947 on, the first few decades post-independence, historians were still primarily interested in social history, economic history, the history of institutions and bureaucracy, and the history of war, let's say, conquest. So even Mughal historians, people who were interested in the Mughal Empire, tended to emphasize details. I don't want to diminish their work. details of economic policy of the Mughals. The classic instance is Irfan Habib's Agrarian System of Mughal India. Some of you might have seen it or referred to it. It's a very difficult book to sort of read cover to cover. I don't think anyone does that. I mean, I shouldn't admit such things, but anyway, that's the classic example, but there are many, adumbrations of that, where the interest is in the institutions for their own sake. The people who inhabit the institutions don't really come out of the narrative. I'll give you a perfect example from my own work. I did my dissertation research on a person named Chandrabhan Brahman, who is he was a Brahmin, as his name indicates, from the Punjab, from Lahore, who rose through the imperial secretarial ranks to become chief secretary under Shah Jahan. The first person he worked for, incidentally, in the Mughal hierarchy was the person who oversaw the financing for the Taj Mahal. So there it is again. Now, Chandrabhan was a Brahmin who wrote in Persian, and about Sufism. He wrote Persian poetry. He also wrote many prose chronicles. He wrote a prose chronicle, not even a chronicle, an account of Shah Jahan's court, and many letters. His Munshat, his letter collection, is still extant. There are a few letters extant in various libraries around the world of letters to him that were in other collections. So we have a body of evidence on which to build a kind of biographical picture of somebody like Chandrabhan. Now, it has not been done. Why? Well, I mean, I did it, but before me, it had not been done. Why? Because if you just think about how someone like him simply doesn't fit any of the existing narratives. He doesn't fit the decline narrative. Now, this is someone who spent the bulk of his career a Brahmin at Shah Jahan's court as one of the key advisors to the emperor and the person who ghost wrote all the imperial correspondence. But it doesn't fit the narrative of creeping orthodoxy as a prelude to Aurangzeb, right? It doesn't fit the narrative of institutional history in the sense that if you read all of Chandrabhan's works, all you will get is a handful of names and dates of important nobles and when their titles were upgraded to something or so forth. So you don't get, so beyond that, mining his works for data, he's not very helpful. And in fact, this is precisely what an earlier generation of historians would say. Someone like Jadunath Sarkar, for instance, said specifically that the writings of Hindu munshis like Chandrabhan was not useful for history. That's the word he uses. They did not have the utility of future historians in mind when they wrote these fripperous, ornate letters, right? I mean, this is the mindset in the early 20th century. Now, that too is part of the decline narrative, that over time, Insha as a genre becomes, too ornamental and too, artistic and difficult to read, and it's just all titles, and you're the king of the world, and the king of the universe, and the king of the Deccan, and the king of this and that, and, it just gets boring after a while. This is basically the narrative. So, for instance, in Chahar Chaman, Chandrabhan's account of Shah Jahan's court, he gives a long, detailed, exhaustive list of all the viziers that he worked for. As I say, all the prime ministers, Mughal prime ministers that he worked for. And for a continuous stretch from 1631 until 1660 or so, the date is hard to nail down, but that is into Aurangzeb's reign, he worked for every single prime minister of the Mughal Empire directly. He gives an account of all of them, what they were like, what their managerial styles were, whether they were good at writing their own letters or if they had to depend on the munshis and the accountants. So you get a sense of the texture of the institutions that you simply cannot get from, the kind of 1960s and 70s era social histories that deal with these institutions. Now, you might think that someone like Chandrabhan, who was a poet, a very good poet, in fact, he's, if you pick up any book on Indian Persian literary history, he will still be listed as, the greatest Hindu poet of Persian. But you would think that in the literary histories, at least, then he would get somebody like him. I'm not using him, just promoting Chandrabhan, although I should, because I have a book coming out. But you would think that someone like him would get, garner some interest. Well, in that you would be wrong. For a couple of reasons. One reason is that, again, two reasons. One, methodological. The methodological problem is that the sources for literary history tend to be tazkiras. Those of you who know anything about literary history, this is a genre that also uses hagiographies, really. You see Sufi hagiographies, tazkiras. You also see them in literature, biographical compendia of the lives of poets. Now, these are very interesting genres. There's an explosion of tazkira writing in the 17th and 18th century in India, and also in Iran and Turkey and other places. But they're anecdotal documents. So this creates all kinds of problems for the later historiography. And the modern positivist historians either use material from tazkiras that they don't admit come from tazkiras, or they just dismiss the genre entirely. They don't grapple with the genre question. So tazkiras kind of create problems. And I don't have time to get into the very interesting tazkira accounts of Chandraban, but maybe in the Q&A I'll tell you some funny stories. The other bigger problem for Mughal historiography, Mughal literary historiography, is that entire period, let's say 16th to the 18th century, is not studied at all in Persian literary history either. Why? Because it's the Sabke Hindi. It's in decline. But why is it in decline? Because of India. Basically, it's India's fault that courtly decadence infiltrated Persian poetry and denaturalized it from its erstwhile romantic what it should have been in the 9th and 8th century. That's a long story. For anyone who's curious, I have an article coming out about this, which you can read. But the point is that the narrative that there's an Indian style of Persian poetry that is malformed, that is decadent, that is basically the literature of decline, has basically created an embargo on not just Indian poets. This is the sad part. Even Iranian poets and Turkish poets and Central Asian poets who wrote during this period and wrote really interesting stuff. For instance, I'll just maybe finish up here. This and one more short point. For instance, since we're talking about modernity and the legacy of Muslim societies in modernity, the late 16th and through the 17th century witnessed one of the most fascinating experiments in modern literature and modernization of literature the world has seen. What 20th century modern literary scholars call Sabke Hindi, the Indian style, the poets at the time actually called Taza Gui, that is to say, speaking the fresh style. And there were many different modulations of the fresh style. In fact, it was contested in many different ways. Over the course of the 17th century, it evolved into what came to be called the tarz-e-khayal, the imaginative style, you might say. This is a kind of imaginative turn, and you see this, you can track it even in the names of texts that start to have the word khayal. There's a new musical genre called khayal at exactly the same moment. So there's a kind of newness in the air that Cemal was talking about that has to do with a lot of things. 1591-92 was the turn of the millennium. There's all kinds of other sense of newness going on in the world. People's encounter with newly mobile populations and so on and so forth. But that whole that whole trajectory remains completely not just under theorized, but unacknowledged because the entire period, as I said, is simply called the Indian style, Sabke Hindi. There's some revisions going on now, but nothing radical enough for my taste. But anyway, I'll finish with this last point, 3A and B. 3A, point 3 really has to do with postcolonial scholarship. Postcolonial scholarship represents another challenge to someone like me who does Mughal historiography in a variety of ways. But the foremost is the sort of rupture thesis that postcolonial scholarship tends to just carry with it. I've learned a ton from postcolonial scholarship, and it's not even a very good term. All of us do postcolonial scholarship, whether we read Homi Bhabha or not. So the kind of problem there. But in any case, if you read the work of those who are seen as the doyens of postcolonial scholarship, you will tend to see over and over again reinforced the notion that anything before the arrival of European colonists is not only, not that interesting, but in fact unknowable. That is, a European technologies of discipline and imposition of European knowledge systems was so profound and so radical that anything before it is in fact tainted by their production of archives, for instance, or so on and so forth. So even if someone like me goes back to the archive and says, hey, I'm reading these Persian texts that don't say what you say they say, or say what the British say, well, you can't really know them because they're archived by the colonial state and so on and so forth. I mean, that would be an extreme version of that argument, but you see it all over the place. Now, that closing off of the pre-modern, maybe it's worse in India than other places, I don't know, but that, okay, good, that makes me feel better, or worse, I don't know, but that closing off creates all sorts of problems for how we write global intellectual history generally. Now, I'll give you a perfect example. I'll skip some of the other stuff I was going to talk about. Maybe I'll pick it up in the Q&A. But a perfect example of what I'm talking about is, for instance, the discipline of comparative philology and linguistics generally. Virtually everyone in this room has probably heard of William Jones, Sir William Jones, the great comparative philologist, the person who discovered the relationship between Sanskrit and Persian and Greek, the Indo-Aryan language diffusion thesis, in his 3rd anniversary discourse at the Asiatic Society in Calcutta. What some of you might not know is that, of course, Jones learned his Persian grammar from a munshi from Bengal who was traveling in England while Jones was still at Oxford, when he was calling himself Yunus Oxfordy. And this munshi, Ittisamuddin was his name, happened to be traveling to England. It's a long story, but he met Jones at Oxford and taught him the opening to Farhang-e Jahangiri, which was a Mughal work of philology from 1608. That was what Jones based his grammar of Persian language on. Further, when he got to India, he learned how to analyze segmental morphemes and these kind of things he had a Brahmin pundit who taught him about Sanskrit, lexicography and various other things. Not only that, but all of at least the Persian literati that were in, the time frame that Jones was learning Persian from these munshis and so forth, would have known the works of Sirajuddin Ali Khan Arzu, who was one of the most celebrated intellectuals of the 18th century in India. Now, this is a man of tremendous philological skill. He's written, 10, 12 books on philology, all of which are, really profound, amazing works of scholarship. Scholarship, not just, he wrote down some words. He was a scholar in the modern disciplinary sense of the word. And he claims it, too. He says, I am doing work that no one has done before, and I'm doing it using methodologies that are more precise and more, modern than what other people did. This is what he says. This is in the 18th century. Now, Arzu also, decades before Jones, scooped Jones. Now, that's one minor thing. Okay, Jones got scooped by someone who was working in Persian, fine. But what also gets lost is the fact that even Arzu, someone like Arzu, was building on centuries of comparative philological scholarship that was happening in India, in Iran, in Central Asia, and all over the place. Now, that narrative of comparative philology in the Indo-Persian world, how do you write that back into global intellectual history? It's not a very straightforward question, given the language that we have available to us to talk about these kind of historical trajectories. But this is a challenge that I kind of try to address in some of the recent work I've been doing. I have an article coming out about that too sometime. It's not on the website, but if anybody wants it, you could just email me. I'll send you the draft. But those are some of the challenges that I see. The last one I won't talk about, but I'll just throw it out there, is that India is kind of a special case in all this, because in India, Islam is quite explicitly foregrounded as a problem for the society and for the culture in a way that I don't think is true in other places that we're talking about here today. I mean, Islam is seen as like a tumor that needs to be excised, really, in the radical world of Indian politics. So it creates other problems for Mughal historiography and how we do it, but I'll stop there. Okay.
Well, thank you very much,
Thank
Safavid.
you. Good morning, and I would like to join the chorus of thanking Jamila Eddin for having organized this conference for the NEH. It's very heartening to see that there's this kind of support still out there for the kind of humanistic work that we're doing. It's also really nice to see friends. It's a great way to connect with friends and to make new ones as well. I took my task here as one where I was going to, or I was asked to see how I inserted myself in Safavi historiography, but to relate it in some way as well to the paradigms of decline and the golden age. And I also thank you for giving me this opportunity to reflect back in a more leisurely way. What I realized was 2 decades of already teaching, and the field, of course, looks very different. But when I entered in the field, very similar kinds of paradigms were in existence around that you, Rajeev, laid out there for Safavi history as well, after the second half of the 17th century, after this great king, Shah Abbas, who reimagines the capital in Esfahan and creates sort of this bridge onto the Armenian quarters, but really onto the world. Every king came to power, and he was either a drunkard or an opium addict. And of course, the blame here not only went to these debauched kings, but also went to the 2 sort of pillars of Safavi authority at the time, the clerics who had taken over, as well as the gholams, the slaves who were of Caucasian background. So they were the ones who were blamed for this. Now, obviously, this paradigm of a golden age or of decline really addresses imperial sort of technologies of power. Addresses issues around military and political institutions. And I was much more interested in hearing voices from below and beyond the court. The part of it, and as I'm sort of reimagining myself, one rewrites one's own history, but certainly part of it was that I was an Iranian. I was living at the same time as I began to come to the States and study of the Iranian Revolution. Mass popular demands were very important in an articulation of desires and a creation of a future. But I was also part of a historiography that had benefited in the 1980s of the civil rights movement, of the feminist movement, of the gay rights movement that had created a very different kind of scholarship, one that was also very much embracing Marxism and desiring of hearing other kinds of voices outside of sort of imperial capitals. I was also lucky to be at a time in Princeton where somebody like Natalie Davis was writing about Martanger, a small peasant in archives who returned back to his home as an imposter, and really opens up a very different way and possibilities of imagining and speculating about the past. I was also lucky to have Cemal Kafadar there at the time, who was very encouraging in taking these kinds of steps of breaking away from traditional historiography of empires. Now, what that did was, I think, 2 important moves in the way in which we understand this past. First of all, really opening up the possibilities of sources outside of chronicles, bringing in poetry, bringing in epics, bringing in art, looking at all of these as cultural production, as telling you something about that particular past and that particular moment, in addition to different techniques and ways of reading. So a linguistic term that it was a real paradigm shifting moment as well, but one that also allowed for anthropology and literature to be breaking the disciplines of history and breaking that distance between anthropology, literature, and history, cultural studies, and the use of analytical tools such as gender and sexuality that opens up very different kinds of readings of the past and of its text. My particular challenge was to how do I look at popular religiosity and the particular ways in which popular religiosity was associated with extremism, with the folk, and really separated from what we understood really as Islamic history as being a very textually transmitted knowledge that is legalistic, that has a lot to do with these sort of high texts studied by very few people, let's say, in the different parts of the Islamic world. And so I dealt with some of that erasures, and that's interesting too, not only historiography, how it comes to tag, which I'll talk about a little bit, these ideas as being irrational or really not worth studying, but a certain erasure that was going on in this early modern period as well of this past, and talking about it in similar terms of irrationality and the folk. So that was one of the challenges which I think that I tried to break away from these imperial modes, but as Jamal is saying, it's difficult really to do that. And part of it is because you have a strongly entrenched historiography there that continues to mark the ways in which the Islamic world is studied. And I wanted to give you a little bit of a texture and contours of that around Western scholarship, around their understandings till now, at least what has been written about, of magic and the occult. And when I'm talking about the occult, I'm really talking about alchemy, geomancy, astrology, and talismans. And you hear some echoes of how Guru Nechipoğlu also talked about the genealogies and writing about art and architecture, and Fletcher comes to mind in particular. So magic and the occult sciences were really cultural and intellectual facts of life in the early modern Islamicate world, sometimes in continuity with ideas and practices that had endured in the region for millennium prior to the advent of Islam. Evidence of this can be found in the pervasive abundance of textual and artifactual traces the occult sciences have left on the historical record, whether through their thorough intertwining with Galenic medical praxis and other post-Hellenistic natural sciences, their omnipresence as literary and artistic topoi, the undated talismans and other paraphernalia that clutter museum collections, or astrology status as an all but ageless Eurasian lingua franca. Somewhat paradoxically, the longue durée of which many of these praxis are possessed has been a key factor in their frequent exclusion from modern discourses of Middle Eastern social, cultural, and intellectual history. George Sarton, the father of the history of science, once derided this profusion of materials as the superstitious Flotsam of the Near East, unquote, an essentially ahistorical backlog which he discouraged historians of science from studying on the grounds that, quote, there cannot be much incentive to encompass that which is indefinite and to investigate the history of something which did not develop. In the context of pre-modern Islamic societies, the occult sciences have frequently been portrayed as not just ahistorical, but anti-historical, as malignant social, intellectual atavisms that survive to the detriment of an otherwise promising civilization. The historians of Islamic science, Manfred Ullmann, bemoaned the intertwining of the natural and occult sciences in pre-modern Islamic thought, an admixture he characterized as a struggle between rationality and irrationality. And the Belgian Orientalist Armand Abel marked the apparent flourishing of works on the occult in the late medieval period as symptomatic of Islam's civilizational decadence and decline. Such analyses have not been limited to expositions of Islam's or Islamdom's place in the history of science. A.J. Arbery struck a similar note in discussing what he narrated as the intrusion of magical practices into late medieval Sufism. He says magic assumed an increasing importance in the late Sufis' repertory. Early Sufism had been refreshingly free of this most mischievous variety of mystification and obscurantism. In this age of decline, as in all similar times, charms and amulets came to acquire special value in the eyes of men no longer confident against the vicissitudes of fortune. Kabbalism and witchcraft provided an attractive substitute for defeated reason. These Western portrayals of the occult sciences as ahistorical and even anti-historical are, I posit, inextricably linked to narratives that evoke the scientific revolution and the whole notion of a bootstrapped transition from medievality to modernity to explain the West's eventual global political and economic hegemony. The overcoming of magical thinking and a conjoined rise of reason as fundamental conditions of this transition long have been key elements to Western modernity's creation myth, and the triumphalist disdain for the occult sciences, displayed as many modern scholars can be understood best as symptomatic of what the theorist of medievalism Bruce Hollister has characterized as the West's abjection of its own medievality. Magic, that bastard art, as James Fraser called it in the Golden Bough, that was the most egregious of offenders in regard to the blending of nature and culture, was felt to belong properly to primitive societies, where it preceded religion and or was antisocial variant of it. The magic's apparent universality and its enduring place as a topic within anthropology is a case in point. Magical elements in Oriental texts, therefore, were viewed either as incidental traces or incursions of popular religion, a realm of practices conceptualized as expressions of primitive religiosity, which had endured at the social and intellectual peripheries of the great regions, or as acts of charlatanry in written form that most scholars of the period were presumed to have dismissed. At work, then, was a further articulation of the objective schema mentioned above, in which the modern West, distinguished by its capacity for analyzing the natural cultural imbroglios of non-modern, non-Western societies, occupied a transcendental position, while Oriental civilization shared a category with the pre-modern West as enterprises which once had possessed some degree of forward momentum and potential for achieving modernity. So how are we then to use this category of early modern, I should come back to, which is in a way a product precisely of this kind of discourses of trying to distinguish the modern West from the medieval East. And so I would like to maybe talk about two possible paradigms and trajectories, some of which really have already been discussed. That's an advantage of coming at a later point in time. And I'm thinking of constantly connected histories, but I'm also thinking of what I would call materiality, looking at art, but in particular what I'm going to talk about, manuscripts, as actors themselves, but also really as artifacts. And I think that may sort of allow us to break away from some of these paradigms that we're stuck in, or conceptions that we're stuck in. When I'm talking about connected histories, I'm also talking, as Professor Kafadar said, about Fletcher, about Dixon's work, but most importantly, I'm thinking of how connected histories have been reconceptualized by Sanjay Subramanian, first formulated in 1997 in his paradigmatic essay, and since mobilized by the author in a couple of studies, including an article in the 2007 American Historical Review. The German historian Ulrike Gleixner has recently suggested that connected histories could be useful for studying gendered forms of piety in Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, since the three religions display strong parallels, such as the emphasis on women's subordination, and interacted in global cities like Isfahan, Cairo, Istanbul, or Amsterdam. In my current work on friendship in the 17th century Isfahan, I follow Gleixner's lead here, but to take connected histories to ask about competing masculinities in the early modern world globally. To simplify Subramanian's complex argument, connected histories represents as critiques of and alternatives to comparative histories of Asian and European state formations, which take European developments as the implicit norm and the measure of global modernity. The concept refers to the multiple shared practices, from trade in goods and slaves to journeys of exploration and empire building, that made Eurasia a zone of interaction and forged linkages between preamble political and cultural entities. In this model, differences in development reside not in a measurable distance of proximity to an abstract set of criteria, but rather in the distant local manifestations and variations of supra-regional connections and global prophecies, something I think Professor Bullitt would be happy to hear, right? Subramanian's main example, interestingly, stems from the domain of culture rather than economics, millenarian political theology. He discusses how ideological constructs in the service of state formation circulated widely alongside merchandise and weapons of technology in early modern Eurasian societies. Muslim and Christian leaders alike believed they were living at the end of time and hence were eager to read the signs correctly and govern accordingly. The political results varied from place to place, often profoundly. Are you kidding? 5 minutes. Yet elites all over Eurasia shared the same millenarian interest in deciphering the signs and even discussed their interpretations with one another. Catholic missionaries centrally facilitated these exchanges, and Subramanian explicitly mentions a conversation between the Portuguese Jesuit Antonio Montserrat and the Mughal ruler Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar. Who else? I do not know whether this particular conversation between a Jesuit and a Mughal ruler turned on issues of gender and sexuality, yet it seems plausible to me that educated elite men conversing about the right action before the end of time would touch on the need, perceived by all religions, for a social order in which men and women lived accordingly to religiously sanctioned gender roles, and that they would dialogue about competing visions of social life, especially in locales where rhetorically schooled Jesuits pushed conversations about Christian European beliefs and practices. Let me just quickly then just go to my own work on early modern masculinities. My work was inspired by Norbert Elias's own work, which charts out civilizing processes in the early modern world, reliant on the production and dissemination of pedagogical manuals of proper etiquette, conduct, and manuals and manners to regulate social behavior and emotional expressions. Elias foregrounds the rise of literacy and printmaking as key phenomena mobilized by confident imperial states to extend their control into the hitherto lightly regulated sites of quotidian religious experiences and everyday social intercourse. My research in Safavid Iran, however, challenges Elias's thesis in one respect, his attribution of print-related disciplinary projects largely to Europe, and critically decenters the predominant focus upon that continent by demonstrating that even before prints spread in Europe, Esfahan's manuscript albums were a medium of communication that performed similarly disciplinary work on the body politic. So I work mainly on majmu'ahs, 17th century albums housed in Iran's manuscript collections that are particularly rich sources for my research. In early modern Esfahan, it was not unusual for a majmu'ah owner to engage in the practice of assembling and preserving fragments of text, ranging from treatises on etiquette, ethics, friendship letters, model letters, marriage contracts. Each majmu'ah bears very important documentary information, such as the date, the location of assembly of the collection, and at times even the names of a scribe and the owner. The majmu'ahs can be understood as portable libraries representing the literary repertoires of educated Esfahanis and their literacies, reading tastes, sensibilities in pre-print culture. And they definitely enjoyed a wide circulation. At the time, we have thousands and thousands that are produced in the 17th century. What I'm focusing on really especially is model letters that are passed down between friends. So a part of this Resail Ikhwaniyat that move outside of the court and now become these model letters that you have to learn in order to enter into the social contract and in social institution of friendship itself. If a friend hasn't seen you for a while, a model letter about chiding the negligent friend, making up friendships that have been broken down by misunderstandings. So I actually look at some of these model letters and the manuals of these disciplinary manuals that are in circulation in Esfahan, and actual letters itself. And this triangulation of these three sources then allow me to look at how the disciplinary effects of this absolute state, at least in Esfahan itself as a new capital city, is affecting behavior and the ways in which emotions are expressed at the time. So just to finish, the 17th century, this culture of epistolarity in Esfahan allows, I think, the historian an entry into a social elite's dynamic of knowledge and affect, where speech, gestures, and gazes were written into the letter, and where the oral and the written fused to shape an alternative mode of communication and form of expressing the emergent self. So these subjectivities that come out, that display themselves, that configure themselves through these different practices are something that I'm interested in. And so these traces of the complex contemporaneous meaning-making of intimacy reside, I think, in these familiar letters, whose location my project identifies at the intersection of the histories of friendship, literacy, and reading and collecting. And I would just want to end by saying it is a huge project, and without the help of friends, that's something which I rely on to get to this point. So thank you.
So many issues that have come up, and I think there's plenty of room for discussion now. So please, if you are wanting to ask a question or make a comment, you raise your hand and you ask your question and you say who you are, you identify yourself. We have 25 minutes?
Yes, half an hour.
Okay, we have half an hour, so that's plenty of time. Somaya, identify yourself.
I'm Sumaya. As Professor Hanna just said, I teach here at George Mason and was very much interested by the comments that were made on the panel and the challenges to the decline thesis, to thinking about modernity, etc. I mean, some of the things that were mentioned had a lot of pertinence even beyond the study of these three empires and their place in world history. When you were speaking about between despotism and chaos, for example, Cemal, I was thinking about the current dynamic in the region and how that sort of dichotomous worldview has left many people feeling unprepared to kind of understand what is happening as these waves of revolts and rebellions come along. I'm sure they're serving coffee and tea in Tahrir Square or Pearl Square. I don't know that this is the new coffee shop, but I was thinking about your use of space and Kathryn's use of the idea of gender and your use, Rajeev, your use of the idea of a kind of professional esprit or a professional tradition in sort of challenging not only the thesis of decline, but also in presenting an alternative that goes beyond these empires and their regions in a kind of way to kind of connect, or as an exercise of connected, connectedness. And I was wondering if actually your thesis of, or your exploration of gender and the way that masculinity is envisioned isn't on some level at play in all of your researches. I mean, if there isn't a kind of degree to which we're looking at phenomena of competing masculinities and competing professional classes who, at the end of the day, get squeezed out and marginalized as a kind of Western notion of masculinity, and professionalism gains ascendancy and dominance in events as well as in historiography. Sorry.
Did any of you want to react to this?
I would like to react to especially what you said about what's happening in the Middle East right now, in Egypt and North Africa. You're so very right. I think the prevalent mode of thinking, even though it does not use that vocabulary, is more or less the same. Right now we have chaos for good reason maybe, but it's going to be back to despotism of a military or a religious sort, but that's what one expects. So that's the nature of not being able to deal with what's going on, as you put it, which I think is very right. And about Tahrir Square, I mean, people really focused during the latest developments on Twitter and stuff like that. Fine, okay. But, I mean, the real hero, the real protagonist, if we're going to talk about mechanisms of communication and organization and networking and all of that, is the very old public square. This is right, exactly. And the public square in particular, the kind that does not exist in Islamic cities, as you know, but well, it is well connected again to a kind of literature that we have been discussing here, and I'm glad to be mentioning the Tahrir Square in a rethinking of political history and political thought in Islam.
Can I also, do you want to respond?
You
Rajeev?
can go ahead.
Yeah?
You can go
Okay.
ahead. then I'll-
So I thank you for your comment. Definitely, it's an important one. And I think that's where early modern matters in some ways, because I think this is where you're beginning to see certain architectures in capital cities. You're beginning to see, the light at night, talking about what you're doing, gas lights, that sort of opens up these dark spaces into really public and surveillance. And there's something going on in Europe at the same time as in the Islamic world, where we shouldn't forget segregation. Also, gendered segregation also existed in Europe in this early modern period. We're no different when we're talking about Islamic societies. And the beginnings of an opening up of these spaces led itself in Europe to the closing of convents, female convents, and sort of a real attack on these all-female spaces. And a particular kind of, I think, masculinity that gets trained and disciplined at court, in an authoritarian moment of time. So in this sense, it really opens up so many doors and possibilities of doing that kind of connected history.
Professor Ackerley?
Can I just quickly respond to that? Yeah. The genderedness of how we write the history of this, or the gender question is a very important one. I mean, I don't personally work on that as much as probably I should, but somebody like Polly O'Hanlon, Rosalind O'Hanlon in England has done really interesting work on the sort of twin modes of masculinity and civility at Akbar's court. But another, Kathryn Butler Brown, who works primarily on music, but has shown how this sort of literary and musical salons, there's a certain codes of civility that emerge that involve. But to me, that's an important question, but there's a larger issue at work, which is simply, demonstrating that people actually had thoughts. It sounds silly to say it out loud, but I mean, it's very common to talk to sort of dyed-in-the-wool Marxists who will say that, maybe it's because I'm from Chicago that this happens, but I come across Marxists who say, oh, but people didn't have a rational self before capitalism. And I said, what are you talking about? But anyway, a perfect example of how that kind of thinking, though, sort of infiltrates, our much more recent scholarship, even as sophisticated as it is. For instance, if you read Chris Bailey's Empire and Information, right? I mean, the model that he lays out, I mean, it's an excellent book. The model he lays out, though, is one of, embodied, what he calls embodied scholarship. That is to say, the native experts, transitioning to, you know, the institutional norms imposed top-down from the British, right? But that model, that idea that there's a kind of embodiment suggests basically, you know, it carries with it the idea that, you know, all these ideas were simply, they existed from time before, from the traditional time, and there's a traditional mode of secretarial practice and traditional mode of scholarship or whatever, and it's just being kept in cold storage generation after generation until people like William Jones can come and discover it. So, I mean, as sophisticated as somebody like Bailey's work is, it still kind of reinscribes that sense that, you know, the cold storage model. And so what I want to, or what I try, you know, to get away from is that cold storage model and try to sort of, for instance, like I said, write a disciplinary history of comparative philology. What would it even look like? Well, none of this stuff is published. You know, like half the stuff, there's one manuscript in Baku, there's one in Bankipur, and that's it. You know, nothing's published. So it's, you know, I didn't talk about this in the end because I ran out of time, but one of the things I was going to say is that I'm actually kind of sanguine about it in the case of Mughal history, because there are significant institutional challenges to being able to do Mughal history 20, 50 years from now that, I don't know, I mean, well, anyway, we should move on to another question.
Professor Curley.
In a sense, I mean, all three talks illustrated one of the questions that was raised at the end of the last panel through this kind of creative, original research which emphasizes certain universal themes, at least at a given time. Then, of course, the humanity of abstract, of people who are basically introduced in abstractions, general labels, will come through. And that will create different kind of dynamics and will have, we hope, an impact on general historiography. But will it? At the same time, I mean, like Rajeev ended his talk about the position of Islam in India. In a sense, I mean, there are different kinds of decline paradigms that you have been alluding to without really leveling with them. There is the sort of one decline of Islam after 1300, it declines. We know it is European sources, but let us not overlook that it is also the theme of Arab nationalism. I mean, in Arab universities, even, I mean, at least by 1990, it is still, I mean, Asl Islamiyya, so ended with the Mamluks. And then it was a different kind of history, Hadith and Muasir. And like Ottomans were not Muslim, I mean, in that context. But then, of course, in the context of Iranian history, it is like, it's the Arab influence that you want to get rid of. In a sense, you're trying to get rid of Islamic history, but then it comes back with vengeance. Then you don't know what to do with other definitions of Iranianness. There is very much a connection between nationalist histories. Of course, in the case of Hindu nationalism, in a sense, is trumping Islamic history, having difficulty in incorporating it. And again, we can analyze the reasons behind it. But decline stories within Ottoman historiography, the Mughal historiography, Safavi historiography, something else than decline in Arab historiography. And since Professor Hanna is there, she can also help us in dealing with this problem. There are differences. And all of this is different than the way, say, von Grunebaum or Bernard Lewis were using, I mean, decline trope, which is quite different than even when Bernard Lewis is alluding to the Ottoman decline as his evidence. But that evidence, I mean, yes, as Cemal knows this best, that's why I'm asking it, the Ottoman sort of narrators of decline are doing something else than Bernard Lewis is trying to do. We can increase these examples, but there are different ways of using decline. At the beginning, Cemal alluded to it, but then sort of left it aside. But maybe it is time to bring it back to the debate so we can differentiate between different kinds of decline tropes out there, or narratives or discourse out of there. In certain ways they are very similar, but at the same time they are doing different purposes. That purpose, I want to underline it, and that's my last bit. While I'm sure all this creative history, really good history using original sources creatively, intelligently, will make an impact in the whole field of history in general, discipline of history. But that may be sort of some ways over there. One way of speeding it up is also confronting more sort of paradigmatic, perhaps philosophical aspects of the thing we're doing, the business of history and what it does, I mean, in terms of learning perceptions of the world and so on and so forth. And that may be related to these different uses of tackling different sort of models or stories of decline that are out there, which are not complementary to each other, they're contradictory to each other, and it creates a problem of perception.
If I may add just a couple of points to show some of these complications. I think there is a distinction between school textbooks kind of decline and academic work kind of decline. And unfortunately, the two have not communicated. Academic work, I don't think anybody today seriously writes about decline. But yet our textbooks, I mean, for school children, anyway, in the Arab world, still talk about decline, still talk about, they're still very much influenced by the colonial, and I guess those countries that have been colonized have an additional meaning to decline, because decline was that period before Western penetration, in whatever form it took. It was a justification. It was a legitimization of colonial presence. Anything before that was decline. So there are so many levels. And anyway, we have to thank you for allowing us to bring up some of these things. I don't want to take up the time. Please, please identify yourself.
Nihad Awad, with the Council on American Islamic Relations. Has nothing to do with the subject matter of today's discussion. But I came with the false impression that in this beautiful conference, thank you very much for granting us the opportunity to learn about the history, the contribution of art, especially from in the Muslim world. I was expecting I will not hear the word politics or even Capitol Hill until Rajeev mentioned that a few days ago there was a hearing in the Congress, and they were debating basically the contribution of Muslims in America through the radicalization of young people, instead of talking about what Muslims do to make life better. I'm interested in Rajeev's actual point of view when you said that Islam in India is seen as the problem. Despite the art historic contribution of Muslims in India, and there's a tendency that they wanted to see Islam being excised in India. I'd like to see, from your perspective, why is that, although Islam has been deeply rooted in India, while this idea is maybe more palatable in the West, they want to see Islam excised because of the lack of compatibility in their views between Islamic culture, Western culture, while in India there's a deeper root of interaction between Muslim and Hindu civilizations.
If I can add, I mean, it's not only in India. I mean, there are certain elements in Turkey as well that see the Islamic past as, am I right? No, that sees the Islamic past as a kind of bad memory.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very big question. I mean, why it is the way it is. I mean, it could take me hours to really do it, but let me try to do it by way of kind of the question of historical narratives and how they become entrenched. What happens in India, I mean, first you have the problem that, you know, the majority population is Hindu. So Hindu fundamentalists or Hindutva activists and so on and so forth, I mean, their understanding of Islam is that it is always foreign, intrinsically foreign. No matter if someone's been there for 500 years or 1,000 years, it doesn't matter. Islam, if you're a Muslim, then you're foreign somehow. I mean, the way it comes out in today's, political discourse is, oh, maybe they're an agent of Pakistan or something, right? I mean, so that sort of the trauma of partition is still very much in there with Indian politics today. And so that, creates problems, all right? And the very deep histories that, get kind of mischaracterized or, conveniently characterized. So that is a problem of like Hindu fundamentalism in Indian politics that, not everyone in India wants to sort of get rid of Islam, but, the dynamic is slightly different in India, I would say, because of this other aspect to it and because of the legacy of partition. But, in the sort of larger conceptual way, part of the way that this is allowed to happen, the way that it becomes so easy for people to become convinced by these kind of narratives, that's a difficult question. And I try to, one way to explain it is using an example from poetry. Some of you might know the famous Tennyson poem, Akbar's Dream. He sort of imagines Akbar talking with Abul Fazl, his trusted advisor, and he's very sort of, he's nervous about the future and what's happening, and he knows he's done good things, but he's nervous, and Abul Fazl says, what's wrong? And he says, well, I had this terrible dream, and he goes and he talks in the dream about all the, liberal edifice that he built and the great, humanitarian and tolerant empire that he has built, but he has a sense of foreboding, and he says, this is Akbar, Tennyson's version of Akbar narrating this dream, and he says, and I watched my son, that is to say Jahangir, the drunk who gave the keys to his wife, I watched my son and those that followed loosen stone from stone all my fair work. And from the ruin arose the shriek and curse of trampled millions, even as in the time before. Now, you think about the way this line is constructed, right? Akbar has built this beautiful empire that is tolerant and so forth, we all know this. But he watches his son and those that come after. So all of his successors basically take down the liberal edifice stone by stone, even as in the time before, right? So everyone before is indicted as well, right? So this is Tennyson, and we can dismiss it as a kind of Orientalist trope, and so on and so forth. Later in the poem, he gives this prophetic vision that the British will, and lo, out the sunset poured an alien race that put stone to stone again, and all this kind of stuff, right? The British are going to come and save India. But the point is that, Akbar, and to a lesser extent, Dara Shikoh, precisely in being held up as these exceptionally tolerant people, and who are constantly, referred to in, recent historiography, because it doesn't use Persian sources. They're constant. So the very focus on them, in fact, reinforces the idea that everyone else was a fanatic. And anyone who likes Bollywood, if you see a movie like Jodha Akbar, recent, very wildly popular historical film about Akbar, now the historicity of that film is really, really, really problematic. But just watching the depictions, Akbar is constantly the tolerant one, and everyone around him, they wear black, they're dressed like Taliban, and all this kind of stuff. But, right, so, that kind of penetration of the popular consciousness is very difficult to get away from. And so how do you, so you have to demonstrate that, there were other Muslims who were tolerant. Wow. Go figure.
Any other questions or comments? Yes.
Ziad, at the history department at Yale currently. I actually had a very practical question involving, in fact, what we're alluding to right now, the connection between popular or political textbook history and the challenging of the decline narrative. And I'm actually wondering, especially with these issues like the victory of the normative orthodoxy over pantheism and all of these kind of things which characterize the 18th and 19th century sort of dominant ideas of history, is it possible to actually translate sort of your work into textbooks or popular histories without offering some form of like an equally Manichaean alternative meta-narrative that can be, again, more palatable, a black and white type of model? In other words, like, so Bailey model you were referring to is, I mean, it's fantastic, but to what degree is it marketable? So I was actually wondering if you could comment on whether it's actually possible to translate that work into popular history.
Doesn't there have to be a will to do so in the first place? Our government, so this, you're moving into politics, really. I mean, the politics of ministries of education.
I mean, I would say in the case of Mughal historiography, I mean, not to be so bleak, but I mean, you have to have the will, and you also have to have the training and the ability to contest these narratives. I mean, the number of people who can read Persian in India anymore is virtually a statistical zero, much less those who can read 17th century manuscripts in Shikasta. I mean, there are a few of us, but in a generation, I don't know. I mean, not to sound so bleak, but, and given the political forces, you know, against it, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'd like to think, I mean, I'm an idealist, I like to think that, you know, precisely what you are suggesting can be done. But you know, one needs a kind of, you know, Shelley Pollack, you know, has talked about the Sanskrit world and has, you know, kind of called recently for an increased attention to critical philology precisely for this reason. I mean, classical language, it's not just Persian, the classical languages of India generally are just kind of withering away for lack of people who can actually read, you know, those texts. I mean, it's, so if you want to, for instance, make the argument that Indo-Persian comparative philology actually feeds directly into what William Jones is doing, which feeds directly into what Franz Bopp is doing, which feeds directly into what Saussure and later generations right up to Chomsky are doing, that the analysis of segmental morphemes by Sanskrit intellectuals and the understanding of language diffusion by Indo-Persian intellectuals is actually a part of the narrative of Western modernity. If you want to make that argument, you have to be able to read Sanskrit grammars. You have to be able to read, you know, Indo-Persian dictionaries from the 10th through the 17th century. There aren't that many who, you know, we don't even have the text available, much less a group of plenty of scholars interested in the subject who can do it, you know, so, you know, anyway, sorry.
Okay, we have one more question out there. Yes, you. Yes.
Thank you. I have a question to the panel
Can
about...
you identify yourself?
Hussein Yilmaz, University of South Florida. A question about the very connectedness of these three empires. Of course, connectedness makes sense only when we conceive of them as divided, which was not divided a short while back during the time of the Mongols, the so-called Mongol peace, or the Great Seljuks, and even preceding them, the Abbasid times. And as you point, it's wonderful to see a number of different connectors, such as commodities, art motifs, certain figures, texts that were taught in different educational institutions, etc. So in this context, I would like to ask two specific questions. First is, to what extent do you think the very contemporaries in the 16th century, let's say, felt that they were connected? Or are we now attributing them that they were connected based on what we find in terms of the exchange of commodities, etc.? Namely, we have in this age a number of texts, biographical texts, dictionaries, for example, compiled in all of these empires. But myself, I don't recall any that includes poets from other areas. So Ottomans wrote for their poets, Mughals wrote for theirs, etc. But if we go back to the Abbasid times, when there's a biographical dictionary, that tends to include all from all over the Abbasid domains. So the first question, to what extent they really felt connected, whether do we have histories or such dictionaries that supersede one of these empires or cultural zones. And secondly, to what extent do you think those very contemporaries might have contributed to the sense of decline? Because again, when they write, read, or talk, the Abbasid period, for example, tended to be a common past. So whether you are an Ismaili or a Shiite, the founding figures are somewhere in some time in the Abbasid period or so. But when they write about their times, so for a typical Ottoman, the Safavids, despite the fact that they might have influenced by Safavid poets and art, etc., but mostly for political reasons, Safavids were not to be praised much, or vice versa. If we especially read Ali's text for Egypt, for example, he doesn't like Egyptians, doesn't find them cultured or civilized as much as the center of the Ottomans. So
Talking of Ali.
Mustafa Ali. So when they talk about other empires,
Can you just get to your question?
sure,
Yeah.
sure. So I mean, their very perception of the other empires, whether that contributed to the decline.
So who wants to react to the two questions?
I could speak out. Connectedness does not necessarily mean they were not aware of separate cultural geographies and identities. So that's one thing. But to go where you ended, and Mustafa Ali is just one example. If you look at trends in the 17th century to talk about Cairo, many Ottoman intellectuals preferred to spend their later mature productive lives in Cairo because they thought of it as a great place and they wrote of it as a great place. If you think about Evliya Çelebi, is one of the greatest Ottoman authors, as I do. The two bookends to his 10-volume magnum opus, one of the greatest works written in that thing that we refer to here as Islamic cultural history. The two bookends are Istanbul and Cairo. I mean, what more tribute can you, and there he pays his tribute to Makrizi and others, and he cherishes it. He loves it. Müneccimbaşı, we can go on and on, as you know, the phenomenon. So Mustafa Ali, fine. I mean, there are all sorts of people going to be, who will be expressing different kinds of opinion on different parts of what they consider their empire or beyond. But I don't think he can be our guide into this process, the larger question you are asking about connectedness and whatnot. I mean, several things here. Of course, they write biographical dictionaries of poets and scholars of different cultural geographies, but at the same time, they write with a notion of sharing a common set of scholarly practices, tools, models, references from an earlier shared stratum of what we call medieval Islamic history. So when Ottoman when an Ottoman scholar like Taşköprüzade writes a book of Ottoman scholars, the biographical dictionary of Ottoman scholars, he knows, it's very clear that the references, the readings, the norms of the people he is giving us there in that biographical dictionary are based on a set of other readings, etc., shared in this broad geography. Moreover, Sepki Hindi, we just talked about it. I mean, there are, if you are looking for that kind of thing, there are very obvious examples of direct connected, contemporaneous connections, if you will. Alişir Nevai, as you know, is the model poet, and the court of Sultan Baykara is the model court for proper, sophisticated patronage for the Ottomans. When Sayyid Ali Reis, the Ottoman admiral, ends up in India, not because he wanted to, but he ends up in India, he tells us, he could be lying, but that he's having all these poetic engagements and conversations and competitions in poetry with many people at the different Indian courts. So on and so forth. I can multiply the examples, and they will all be limited in their way, which does not, I think, contradict the notion of connectedness. But the connectedness, for one, is rooted in a notion of a shared past, of cultural references, at least, where the dictionaries are. I mean, from Delhi to Sarajevo, or from Calcutta to Sarajevo, you will find people using probably Muhit, and they would know that some colleague over there is probably using Muhit, if you're looking for dictionaries. And in the 17th century, you probably know this, see, Hezarfen Hüseyin, your namesake, wrote a dictionary of Ottoman, Persian, Indian vocabulary. This is in the circa 1670. So I think there was continued interest. There's an early 18th century translation of the memoirs of Jehangir into Ottoman Turkish. There's a layer of direct connections that nobody's explored yet.
I would just add that in addition to this shared body of knowledge that creates this new imagined communities, there's also a real conscious competition with one another, image making between the Mughal of each sultan and king and the Safavids and the Ottomans is a very important aspect of creating their own self-identity for their realms, and hence all of these objects, whether from buildings to artwork, are so much part of this status building and this competition to show off to one another in particular. In addition to the fact that you have diaspora communities that move between Istanbul and the Iranian world and India very comfortably. And I would actually add that what you say about this last period of time, it's not an era of decline for the Safavids and for the Mughals. It's more about a tarikh jadid. It's about taze. It's about a newness, a new freshness, which contradicts our notion of decline there.
Okay, we're now getting signs that the session is over.
Could I just add something really quick?
How long is it going to be?
37 seconds. First, I should clarify, I wasn't suggesting that it was a period of decline. I was saying that's how the historiography portrays it, so it's a black hole. But secondly, just on this last question, just to add my 2 cents, I can't add much more to what my colleagues have said, except to say that the evidence from the Mughal sources is basically indisputable that there was a sense of shared sort of, at least metageography and so on and so forth. And I think the premise of your question, maybe I don't know if I agree with the premise of your question, precisely for reasons that Professor Babayan pointed out. I mean, to have a sense of derision and a sense of cultural competitive one-upmanship requires a sort of shared. I mean, no one would seriously argue that because the English and the French hate each other, that they're not part of a shared sort of world. So, I mean, I don't know where that leaves us.